In 2003, Britain's Prince Charles made headlines by expressing his concerns about the dangers of grey goo. Like Bill Joy, he'd become caught up in Eric Drexler's idea of self-replicating nanobots that could end up destroying everything in their attempt to replicate themselves. Prince Charles later backtracked, but not until after his concerns had led to the UK's Royal Society and Royal Academy of Engineering launching a far-reaching study on the implications of nanotechnology. The popular image of nanobots as miniaturized, fully autonomous robots is one of the zombies of the nanotechnology world. It's an image that just won't die, despite having barely a thread of scientific plausibility about it. There's something about the term nanobot that journalists cannot resist using, and that university press offices seem capable of resisting in their attempts to make nanoscale research seem sexy and futuristic. Even as I write this, a quick Google search returns 3 pages of news articles mentioning nanobots in the last month alone. Yet despite the popular image's appeal, there's a world of difference between the technology seen in Transcendence and what's happening in labs now. This is not to discredit the research that often underlies the use of the buzzword. Scientists are making amazing strides on disease-busting particles that can be biologically programmed to seek out and destroy cancer cells, or can be guided through the bloodstream using magnets or ultrasonic waves. And there have been some quite incredible breakthroughs in developing complex molecules, including using DNA as a programmable molecular construction set that operate much like minuscule molecular machines. These are all advances that have attracted the term nanobot, and yet there are night and day differences between the science they represent and imagined scenarios of minute autonomous robots swimming through our bodies or swarming through the environment. Yet the idea of nanobots as a future reality persists. As an early popularizer of nanobots, Eric Drexler was inspired by the biological world and the way in which organisms have evolved to efficiently manufacture everything they need from the atoms and molecules around them. To Drexler, many biological molecules are simply highly efficient molecular machines that strip materials apart atom by atom and reassemble them into ever more complex structures. In many ways, he saw these as analogous to the machines that humans have developed over the centuries: wheels, cogs, engines, and even simple robots, but at a much, much smaller level. And he speculated that once we have full mastery over how to precisely build materials atom by atom, we could not only match what nature has achieved, but surpass it, creating a new era of technologies based on nanoscale engineering. Part of Drexler's speculation was that it should be possible to create microscopically small, self-replicating machines that are able to disassemble the materials around them and use the constituent atoms to build new materials, including replicas of themselves. This would allow highly efficient, atomically precise manufacturing and nanobots that can make almost anything on demand out of what they could scavenge from the surrounding environment. Drexler's ideas are the inspiration behind the nanobots seen in Transcendence, where these microscopically small machines are capable of building and rebuilding solar cells, support structures, and even replacement limbs and organs, all out of the atoms, molecules, and materials in their environment. While this is a vision that sounds decidedly science fiction, it's one that on the surface looks like it should work. After all, it's what nature does, and it does so well. We're all made of atoms and molecules, and depend on evolved biological machines that use and make DNA, proteins, cells, nerves, bones, skins, and so on. And just like nature, where there's a constant battle between good biological machines, the molecular machines that keep us healthy and well, and bad ones, the proteins, viruses, and bacteria that threaten our health, Drexler's vision of molecular machines is one that also has its potential downsides. One scenario that Drexler explored was the possibility that a poorly designed and programmed nanobot could end up having an overriding goal of creating replicas of itself, potentially leading to a runaway chain reaction. Drexler speculated that if these nanobots were designed to use carbon as their basic building blocks, they would only stop replicating when every last atom of carbon in the world had been turned into a nanobot. As we're all made of carbon, this would be a problem. This is the grey goo scenario, and it's what prompted both Bill Joy and Prince Charles to raise the alarm over the risks of nanotechnology. And yet, despite their concerns and those of others, it is a highly improbable scenario. In order to work, these rogue nanobots would need some source of power. Like we find in biology, this would most likely come from chemical reactions. The heat they could scavenge from their surroundings, heat directly from the sun, or most likely a combination of all three of these. But to scavenge energy, the nanobots would need to be pretty sophisticated, and to maintain and replicate this sophistication, they would need an equally sophisticated diet that would depend on more than just carbon alone. In addition to this, because there would be replication errors and nanobot malfunctions, these nanomachines would need to be programmed with the ability to repair themselves. This in turn would require additional energy demands and levels of sophistication. Even with a high level of sophistication, random errors would most likely lead to generation of bots that either petered out because they weren't perfect, or started to behave differently from previous generations, much like biological mutations. And this leads to a third challenge. At some point, the nanobots would find themselves hitting the limits of being able to replicate exponentially. This might be due to an accumulation of replication errors or increasing competition with mutant nanobots. Or it could be brought about by a scarcity of physical space or energy or raw materials. However it happened, a point would be reached where the population of nanobots either became unsustainable and crashed, or reached equilibrium with its surroundings. The chances of nanobots overcoming all three of these challenges and creating a grey goose scenario are infinitesimally small. This is, in part, because the chances of something else happening to scupper their plans of world domination are overwhelmingly large. And we know this because we have a wonderful example of self-replicating systems to study: life on Earth. DNA-based life is, in many ways, the perfect example of Drexler's molecular machines. It shows us what is possible, but it also indicates rather strongly what is not, as well as demonstrating what is necessary to create a sustainable system. We know from studying the natural world that sustainability depends on diversity and adaptability, two characteristics that are notably absent in the grey goose scenario. We also know that sustainable systems based on evolved molecular machines are incredibly complex, so complex in fact that they are light years away from what we are currently capable of designing and manufacturing. In effect, for a Drexler-type form of nanotechnology to emerge, we would have to invent an alternative form of biology, one that is most likely as complex as the biology that we're all familiar with. This may one day be possible, but at the moment we're about as far from doing this as the Neanderthals were from inventing quantum computing. Yet here's the rub. Even though self-replicating nanobots and grey goo lie for now in the realm of fantasy, this hasn't stopped the idea from having an impact on the decisions people make, including the decisions of ITS to attempt to murder a number of nanotechnologists. This is where technological speculation gets serious in a bad way. It's one thing to speculate about what the future of tech might look like, but it's another thing entirely where make-believe is treated as plausible reality, and this, in turn, leads to actions that end up harming people. Technoterrorism is an extreme case, and thankfully a rare one, at the moment at least. But there are many more layers of decision-making that can lead to people in the environment being harmed if science fantasy is mistaken for science fact. If policies and regulations, for instance, are based on improbable scenarios or a lack of understanding of what a technology can and cannot do, people are likely to suffer unnecessarily. Similarly, if advocacy groups block technologies because of what they imagine their impacts will be, but they're working with implausible or impossible scenarios, people's lives will unnecessarily be impacted. And if investors and consumers avoid certain technologies because they've bought into a narrative that belongs more in science fiction than science reality, potentially beneficial technologies may never see the light of day. Of course, All new technologies come with risks and challenges, and it's important that as a society we work together on addressing these as we think about the technological futures we want to build. In some cases, the consensus may be that there are some routes that we're not ready for yet. But what a tragedy it would be if we turned away from some technological futures that could transform lives for the better, simply because we became confused between reality and make-believe. Here, Transcendence definitely lives in the world of make-believe, especially when it comes to visions of nanotechnology that's woven into the movie's narrative. And this is fine as long as we're aware of it, but as soon as we start to believe our own fantasies, we have a problem. Thankfully, not every science fiction movie is quite as rooted in fantasy as Transcendence. As we'll see with the next movie, The Man in the White Suit, some provide surprisingly deep insights into the reality of cutting-edge science and emerging technologies, including the realities of modern-day technology.